Imagine this. The year is 1861. The United States of America is teetering on the edge of the worst war in its history. Abraham Lincoln needs a general, not just any general, the best one. The one man every military officer in Washington agrees is the finest soldier alive. His name is Robert Edward Lee, and Lincoln's senior advisor, the legendary Winfield Scott, calls Lee into his office and makes him an offer that almost no soldier in American history had ever received: command of the entire Union Army, the most powerful fighting force in the Western Hemisphere. Lee listens carefully. He thanks the man, and then he turns it down. Think about what that means for a second. Lee did not just decline a promotion. He did not politely ask to be assigned to a different post. He went home to his mansion in Arlington, Virginia, sat down at his desk, and wrote a letter resigning from the United States Army. The army he had served for 30 years. The army that educated him, paid him, and made him who he was. He folded that letter, put on a gray coat, and crossed over to the side that was trying to tear the United States apart. Within weeks, he was commanding Confederate forces. Within a year, he was the most feared military mind in the entire war. Now here is the part that makes your brain short-circuit. Today, more than 160 years later, Robert E. Lee is one of the most celebrated figures in American history. For over a century, enormous bronze and marble statues of him towered over public squares in cities across the South and beyond. Military schools hung his portrait on their walls. Cadets studied his campaigns the way theology students study scripture. Towns, highways, elementary schools, national parks, counties, all named after him. A man who committed the most serious act of betrayal imaginable against his country became a permanent fixture in that country's Hall of Heroes. How does that happen? Seriously, how? How does a general who fought against the United States of America end up being treated like one of its greatest sons? How does a man who spent 4 years trying to destroy the Union get honored more than many of the men who saved it? That is not a small question. That is one of the most revealing questions in all of American history. And the answer will tell you things about power, about memory, about the stories nations tell themselves when the truth is too uncomfortable to live with. Today we are going to answer that question completely. And I want to warn you right now, this is not going to be a simple story. Robert E. Lee was not a simple man. He was brilliant and conflicted, loyal and treacherous, gentle in manner and brutal in consequence. He is the kind of historical figure who resists easy judgment, which is exactly why he has been so easy to mythologize. People have been projecting their needs onto him for a century and a half. We are going to strip all of that away. We are going to look at who he actually was, what he actually did, and who actually built the legend, because the legend did not build itself. By the end of this video, you are going to see Robert E. Lee in a completely different light. You are going to understand not just the man, but the machine that turned him into a myth. A machine made up of grieving widows, bitter ex-Confederate officers, and a political movement that needed a hero to justify a catastrophic and unjust cause. That machine changed American culture for generations. It shaped how the Civil War was taught in schools. It shaped how monuments were built. It shaped how a nation processed its own shame. And understanding it is not just a history lesson. It is a lesson about the present. Let us begin. To understand Robert E. Lee, you have to understand Virginia in the early 1800s. Not just the state, the idea. Virginia was not simply a place. It was a mythology unto itself. In the minds of its wealthy white citizens, Virginia was the cradle of American civilization, the birthplace of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. More presidents came from Virginia than from any other state. The Virginian planter class saw themselves not as Americans who happened to live in Virginia, but as Virginians who had graciously agreed to participate in America. The state was their identity, their religion, their entire world. Into this world, on January 19, 1807, Robert Edward Lee was born. His father was Henry Lee III, known universally as Light Horse Harry Lee. Say that name to any American history student, and they will recognize it immediately. Light Horse Harry was a Revolutionary War hero, a celebrated cavalry commander, a man who gave the famous eulogy for George Washington, in which he called him first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Robert grew up in the shadow of that legend, except the legend had a serious problem. His father was also a complete disaster as a human being. Light Horse Harry Lee was reckless, irresponsible, and financially incompetent on a spectacular scale. He speculated wildly in land deals. He borrowed money he could never repay. He went to debtor's prison twice. When Robert was only 2 years old, a pro-Federalist mob attacked Light Horse Harry, disfigured him, nearly killed him, and left him permanently broken in both body and spirit. He fled to Barbados to recover, leaving his wife and children behind. He died there when Robert was 11, essentially a stranger to his own son. The great hero of the Revolution left his family in poverty and shame. Robert Lee grew up understanding what it meant to have a famous name and no money to go with it. This is crucial to understanding everything that follows. Robert Lee was obsessed, truly obsessed with honor. Not in the abstract philosophical sense, in the very specific, very Virginia sense. Honor was reputation. Honor was how other men of your class spoke about you behind your back. Honor was the thing your father had squandered, and you had to rebuild from scratch. Lee entered West Point in 1825, determined to prove something to the world, and more importantly to himself. He graduated second in his class in 1829. He received not a single demerit in 4 years. Not one. In the entire history of the Academy, that is nearly unheard of. Robert E. Lee was a man of almost terrifying self-discipline. He served in the Army Corps of Engineers. He distinguished himself brilliantly in the Mexican-American War, where Winfield Scott called him the finest soldier he had ever seen. He served as superintendent of West Point. By the time the Civil War approached, Lee was 53 years old, with a white beard, a ramrod-straight posture, and the kind of dignified bearing that made people around him feel like they were in the presence of something ancient and serious. Men who met him remembered the encounter for the rest of their lives. There was something about Lee that commanded instant, instinctive respect. He seemed almost too perfect, too composed, too noble, which, it turns out, is exactly why what happened next was so strange. Because here is what the textbooks usually skip over. At the moment of his great decision in April of 1861, Robert E. Lee did not actually want Virginia to secede. He called secession foolish. He wrote to his son that he could anticipate no greater calamity than a dissolution of the Union. He wrote that he considered the Southern states to be in the wrong. He wrote these things in his own letters, in his own handwriting, and then he did it anyway. He resigned his commission and joined the Confederacy. Why? That single question is the key that unlocks the entire story, because the answer reveals not just who Lee was, but how the myth about him was built on a foundation that was much weaker than it looked. When people try to explain why Robert E. Lee chose Virginia over the United States, they almost always reach for the same explanation. They say he could not bring himself to fight against his home state. They say it was about loyalty to his people. They say he was a man of his time and his place, and that place was Virginia, and Virginia was leaving. And there is something true in that explanation, but it is nowhere near the complete picture, because if we accept that explanation at face value, we have to ignore some very uncomfortable facts that Lee himself left behind in writing. Let us start with slavery, because you cannot tell the story of the Civil War honestly without it, and you cannot tell the story of Robert E. Lee honestly without it either. Lee was a slaveholder, not a reluctant, tortured one who hated the institution but felt trapped by it. He was an active, functional slaveholder who inherited enslaved people from his father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis, when Custis died in 1857. The will specified that all enslaved people on the estate should be freed within 5 years. Lee, as executor of the estate, stretched that timeline to the very last possible moment. He freed them in December of 1862, Only after the Emancipation Proclamation made it politically awkward to do otherwise. We also have a letter Lee wrote in 1856 about slavery. In it, he called slavery a moral and political evil. Sounds good, right? But read the whole letter. He also wrote that slavery was a greater evil to the white man than to the black man. He wrote that the painful discipline of slavery was necessary for the black race's instruction in the principles of civilized society. He wrote that abolitionists were trying to accelerate emancipation, but that this would only increase the evil. He was not opposing slavery, he was defending it, while using the language of moral concern. This is a man who understood rhetoric. He knew exactly what he was writing and why. There is also the matter of what happened at Arlington after he took over the Custis estate. Multiple accounts, including testimony from enslaved people themselves, describe Lee as a harsh and demanding master. One account describes an incident in which 3 enslaved people who had attempted to escape were recaptured and returned. According to one witness, Lee personally ordered them to be whipped, and when the overseer hesitated, Lee directed that salt be rubbed into the wounds. Lee disputed this account, but the people who recorded it had no obvious motive to fabricate it. This is not the portrait of a reluctant, anguished man who hated what he was doing. This is a man operating within the system of slavery without apparent moral crisis. So when Lee made his choice, in April of 1861, when he put on the gray uniform and picked up the Confederate sword, he was not simply following some abstract principle of state loyalty detached from the question of slavery. He was making a choice to defend a social and economic order that he was personally embedded in and personally benefiting from. The Confederacy was not fighting for some vague philosophical notion of states' rights. It was fighting for the right of states to maintain the institution of slavery. Every Confederate state said so explicitly in its Articles of Secession, not in coded language, not in euphemism, in plain, blunt English. Mississippi's Declaration of Secession begins with the words, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." South Carolina cited the threat to slavery as its first and primary reason for leaving. Georgia, Texas, Virginia, they all said the same thing in different words. The war was about slavery. This was not controversial at the time. Everyone on both sides knew it. The mythology that turned it into a war about abstract constitutional principles came later. It was manufactured after the fact. And Robert E. Lee, the man at the center of that mythology, knew perfectly well what he was fighting for. He just never said it quite that plainly. Now set aside for a moment the question of what Lee was fighting for, because whatever the cause, what he did on the battlefield was genuinely extraordinary, and this is important to understand. The mythology that grew up around Lee was not built on pure fantasy, it was built on a real foundation of military achievement. If Lee had been a mediocre general, the myth could never have taken hold. The myth required something real to attach itself to, and on the battlefield, Robert E. Lee gave his admirers plenty of real material to work with. When Lee took command of what became the Army of Northern Virginia in June of 1862, the Confederacy was in serious trouble. Union forces under George McClellan had pushed to within a few miles of Richmond, the Confederate capital. The war seemed close to over. Lee launched a series of furious, almost reckless counterattacks, known as the 7 Days Battles. He drove McClellan back from Richmond. Then he turned north and smashed another Union army at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Then, against every principle of conventional military wisdom, he invaded the North. He was outnumbered, he was outgunned, he did it anyway. The Battle of Antietam in September of 1862 was the bloodiest single day in American military history. 23,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. Lee's army was badly damaged. He retreated back to Virginia, but he was not finished. The following December, he won one of the most lopsided defensive victories of the entire war at Fredericksburg, where Union forces lost more than 12,000 men in frontal assaults against Confederate positions Lee had described as being so strong that he was almost ashamed of it. Then came Chancellorsville in May of 1863, widely considered the masterpiece of Lee's career. At Chancellorsville, Lee faced a Union army roughly twice the size of his own. He did something that military theorists still discuss in war colleges today. He split his outnumbered force in the face of the enemy, something you are simply never supposed to do, and sent Stonewall Jackson's corps on a long flanking march around the entire Union army. Jackson hit them from the side at dusk. The Union flank collapsed. The Union commander, Joe Hooker, was stunned into paralysis. Lee's army won a staggering, improbable victory. The victory cost them Jackson, accidentally shot by his own men in the confusion and dead a week later. But it cemented Lee's reputation as something close to a military genius. Here is where we need to stop and ask a harder question, though, because Lee's brilliance as a tactician came with a very significant cost. He won battles, beautiful, audacious, stunning battles, but he lost the war. And this is not just a matter of the South being outgunned and outmanned, which they were. It is also a matter of strategic choices that Lee made, which accelerated the Confederacy's defeat. His offensives were tremendously expensive in blood. The Army of Northern Virginia bled itself white, winning tactical victories that had no strategic payoff. Lee's army had irreplaceable casualties it could never make up. He was, in the deepest sense, a general who was too good at winning battles to win the war. The most obvious example is Gettysburg. In July of 1863, Lee invaded Pennsylvania for the second time. His army was at or near its peak strength. The invasion was meant to demonstrate to the Northern public that the Confederacy could strike them at home and hopefully draw foreign intervention from Britain or France. On the third day of the battle, Lee ordered an assault that still baffles military historians. 12,500 Confederate soldiers marched in perfect formation across nearly a mile of open ground directly into concentrated Union artillery and rifle fire. It was called Pickett's Charge, and it was a catastrophe. More than half the men who went forward did not come back. The Confederate cause never recovered. But here is what made Robert E. Lee genuinely magnetic and what made the mythology possible in the first place. He was not just a brilliant tactician. He was a remarkable human presence. The men who served under him felt something for him that went beyond respect or admiration. They called him Mas Robert. That is a corruption of Master Robert, a term of address that tells you something deeply uncomfortable about the culture that produced it. But the emotional reality underneath that term was genuine. These men would have followed Lee anywhere. They did follow him for 4 years, through conditions of almost unimaginable hardship, and they never stopped believing in him. Lee had a talent for inspiring loyalty that few commanders in history have matched. He was always at the front, not hiding in a comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines, but right there, on horseback, under fire, visible to his troops. His horse was a gray stallion named Traveler, a beautiful animal that became almost as famous as its rider. When Lee rode along the lines before a battle, men who had not eaten in days and had no shoes on their feet would cheer themselves hoarse. They cheered not because they had to. They cheered because something about this white-haired, dignified, almost impossibly composed old man made them believe that whatever happened next was going to be all right. He also genuinely cared about his men in the ways that counted. He was meticulous about supply and logistics, constantly pushing the Confederate government to feed, clothe, and equip his soldiers better. He wrote personally to the families of officers killed in his command. He visited the wounded when he could. He was polite to everyone, from senior generals to the youngest private, in a way that was not performed, but seemed to come from something fundamental in his character. There are dozens of accounts from soldiers who met him briefly and never forgot it. He had the gift of making men feel seen and valued, and in the middle of a brutal war, that gift was worth more than any number of brilliant tactical maneuvers. His personal physical presence was striking. Lee stood just under 6 feet tall, which was considerable for the era. He was broad-shouldered and compact, with the posture of a man who had been trained since boyhood to carry himself correctly. His hair and beard had gone white early, which, paradoxically, made him look more commanding rather than older. His eyes were dark and warm and intensely watchful. He dressed simply by the standards of Confederate generals, preferring a plain gray coat with minimal insignia. In photographs, there is something almost impossibly dignified about him. He looks the way people imagined a general should look. He looks, in a word, like the myth before the myth had been invented. And this is where it gets complicated, because the personal qualities were real. The courage was real. The devotion to his men was real. The intelligence was real. Robert E. Lee was genuinely, authentically, in many ways, an admirable human being. This is not comfortable to say, because we know what he was fighting for, and we know what defending that cause cost in human suffering. But history does not deal in simple characters. The man who inspired such fierce loyalty, who showed such grace under pressure, who bore defeat with such quiet dignity, was also the man who took up arms against his country to preserve the institution of slavery. Both of those things are true at the same time. And the mythology that grew up around Lee was built by taking the first truth and erasing the second entirely. By the spring of 1865, the game was up. Grant had been grinding Lee's army down for almost a year in the brutal campaigns of the Overland and the siege of Petersburg. Lee's men were deserting by the thousands. They had no food. They had no ammunition. The Confederate government had abandoned Richmond. Lee was trying to march west to link up with other Confederate forces, but Grant was moving faster. On April 7, 1865, Grant sent Lee a note. He told him the situation was hopeless and asked him to surrender. Lee wrote back. The exchange of letters over the next 2 days is one of the most remarkable pieces of military correspondence in history. Dignified, formal, almost tender. Two great soldiers acknowledging a reality neither of them wanted. April 9, 1865, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. A small, unremarkable village in the middle of nowhere. Robert E. Lee rode to meet Ulysses S. Grant in the parlor of a man named Wilmer McLean. McLean had the strange distinction of having his first home destroyed in the First Battle of Bull Run, and then moving to what he thought was a safer location, only to have the entire Civil War end in his living room. Lee arrived in his best uniform, polished boots, ornate dress sword. He looked exactly the way a defeated general should not look. Grant arrived late in a muddy field coat with only his rank insignia to distinguish him from an enlisted man. The contrast was almost theatrical. The terms Grant offered were generous to the point of being almost shocking. Lee's officers could keep their sidearms. The men could keep their horses. Nobody would be arrested or tried for treason as long as they obeyed the laws of the United States going forward. Grant even ordered food sent to Lee's starving men. When Union artillery began firing salutes to celebrate the victory, Grant ordered them to stop. He did not want to humiliate the defeated enemy. There would be no prisoners paraded through the streets of Washington, no public shaming. Grant wanted reconciliation, and he built reconciliation directly into the surrender terms. This generosity would have enormous consequences that Grant probably never fully anticipated. Lee rode away from Appomattox on Traveler, back to his waiting men. What he said to them was brief and remarkably composed for a man who had just watched everything he spent 4 years fighting for collapse into dust. He told them they had fought courageously and faithfully. He said there was nothing left for him to do but to go home and make the best of their altered circumstances. Then he rode away. Men wept openly. Veterans who had survived every horror the war could throw at them broke down completely. They were not just mourning a military defeat. They were mourning Lee. They were mourning the idea of Lee. And that mourning was the seed from which the myth would grow. In the days and weeks after Appomattox, something interesting began to happen. The Union had won. The Confederacy was gone. Slavery was abolished. 4 years of catastrophic violence had finally ended. But the people who had fought for the Confederacy were still there, millions of them. They still lived in the same towns. They still owned the same land, or what was left of it. They still had the same names and the same families and the same social networks. And they were faced with a question that has no comfortable answer. How do you go on living in a country you tried to destroy? How do you make sense of 4 years of sacrifice if the cause you sacrificed for was wrong? The easiest answer, and the one millions of people chose, was to decide that the cause was not wrong. To decide that the war had not really been about slavery after all. To construct a new story in which the South had fought a noble, principled battle for constitutional liberty and states' rights, and had lost only because it was outgunned and overwhelmed by a larger and wealthier enemy. This story had a name. Historians call it the Lost Cause, and the Lost Cause needed a hero. It needed a figure who could embody the virtues of the Old South without the embarrassing baggage. A figure so obviously noble, so clearly honorable, so visibly admirable, that no one would look too hard at the cause he served. The Lost Cause chose Robert E. Lee. And Lee, to be fair, was not entirely a passive participant in this process. After Appomattox, he accepted the presidency of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, a small and nearly bankrupt institution that he helped transform. He counseled reconciliation publicly. He told former Confederate soldiers to go home, obey the law, and be good citizens. He did not join the memorialization movement directly. He did not write inflammatory memoirs blaming his subordinates. He did not give fiery speeches calling for resistance. He accepted defeat with the same composed dignity he had shown throughout the war, and that dignity, that almost superhuman calm in the face of catastrophe, was the raw material the mythmakers needed. They took it and ran with it. Jubal Early was not a nice man. He was prickly, combative, deeply unpleasant in social settings, and possessed of an ego that his accomplishments could not quite justify. During the war, he had been a competent, but not exceptional, Confederate general, one of Lee's corps commanders in the later stages of the conflict. After Appomattox, he refused to accept the surrender terms or swear allegiance to the United States. He fled to Mexico, then to Canada, then to Cuba, fuming and scheming all the while. When he finally returned to Virginia in 1869, he came back with a mission. He was going to tell the story of the Civil War, and he was going to tell it his way. Early became the founding force behind what historians call the Lost Cause mythology. He organized the Southern Historical Society, which gathered and published documents, memoirs, and historical analyses from Confederate perspectives. He wrote and commissioned articles arguing that the South had fought a just and noble war for constitutional principles, that slavery was not the cause of the conflict, and that the only reason the Confederacy lost was because it was hopelessly outgunned. He was a tireless propagandist with a lawyer's skill for constructing a convincing argument from selective evidence, and he made Robert E. Lee the cornerstone of the entire edifice. In the Lost Cause narrative, Lee was not merely a talented general, he was a saint in military uniform. He was the embodiment of everything the Old South claimed to represent: honor, chivalry, self-sacrifice, Christian faith, aristocratic dignity. He was the cavalier ideal made flesh. The story Early and his colleagues told was almost identical across every telling. Lee was a man of such profound personal integrity that he agonized over his decision to join the Confederacy. He was not fighting for slavery, he was fighting for Virginia. He was fighting for the principle that a man's first loyalty is to his home and his people. He was a tragic hero, a figure of almost Shakespearean grandeur, crushed by fate rather than by his own choices. The genius of this narrative was that it was constructed around Lee's genuine virtues. Early did not have to invent Lee's courage or his brilliance or his dignity. Those were real. What he had to do was build a frame around those virtues that excluded certain other things. The frame excluded slavery as the cause of the war. The frame excluded Lee's own enslaved people. The frame excluded the fact that Lee had continued to fight for almost a year after it was clear the war was lost, costing tens of thousands of additional lives. The frame excluded Gettysburg, or explained it away by blaming James Longstreet, who became the Lost Cause's convenient scapegoat for every Confederate failure. The frame was carefully constructed to include everything beautiful and exclude everything damning. And Early was not working alone. He had allies everywhere. Former Confederate officers wrote memoirs that echoed his narrative. Southern newspapers ran pieces that glorified Lee and the Confederate cause. The United Confederate Veterans, founded in 1889, organized reunions and memorial events that kept the mythology alive and gave it new generations of adherents. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, founded in 1894, became perhaps the most effective and underestimated force in the entire operation. They were organized, well-funded, highly motivated, and completely committed to shaping how the Civil War was remembered in American culture. The United Daughters of the Confederacy pressured school boards to adopt textbooks that presented the Confederate perspective. They lobbied publishers to change or remove passages that accurately described slavery as the cause of the Civil War. They funded monuments. They placed Confederate flags in statehouses and public buildings. They wrote history curricula that were adopted not just in southern states, but in some northern ones as well. They were extraordinarily effective at their goal, which was nothing less than controlling the historical memory of an entire nation. And at the center of every monument they built, every curriculum they shaped, every argument they made, was Robert E. Lee. The monuments deserve a chapter of their own, because the story of when they were built is just as important as the story of why. You might assume that the statues of Robert E. Lee and other Confederate figures were built shortly after the Civil War by grieving communities memorializing their dead. Some were, but the great majority of them were not. The peak periods of Confederate monument construction were not the 1860s or 70s. They were the 1910s and 20s, and then again the 1950s and 60s. These dates are not coincidental. They correspond precisely to two of the most important periods in African American history. The 1910s and 20s were the era of Jim Crow at its most brutal. They were the era of the Great Migration, when African Americans began leaving the South in enormous numbers for cities in the North. They were the era of widespread racial terror, of lynchings, of the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, which reached peak membership of several million in the early 1920s. This was also the era when D.W. Griffith's film The Birth of a Nation was released. A technically brilliant and morally catastrophic piece of cinema that portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroes and Reconstruction as a period of black tyranny over noble white Southerners. President Woodrow Wilson screened it in the White House. He called it history written with lightning. In this context, Confederate monuments were not just memorials. They were messages. They were public declarations of who held power and who did not. They were placed in courthouse squares, the centers of civic life, specifically to remind African American citizens of their status. A statue of Robert E. Lee on horseback in front of a courthouse where black defendants stood trial was not an innocent historical commemoration. It was a statement of dominance. It was telling black Americans, and anyone else who needed reminding, that the values of the Confederacy, white supremacy first among them, were still operative in that community, regardless of what the law said. Then, the second wave. The 1950s and 60s were the years of the Civil Rights Movement. Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 56, the sit-ins, the Freedom Rides, the March on Birmingham, the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. At exactly the same time that African Americans were making unprecedented political and legal progress, Southern state governments and white civic organizations were erecting Confederate monuments at an accelerated pace. Mississippi added the Confederate battle emblem to its state flag in 1964, not 1864, 1964. This is the context in which the monuments of Robert E. Lee exist. They were not built to honor history. They were built to make a political argument. They were built to say that the South's cause had been right and noble, that the men who fought for it deserved to be honored, and that African Americans had better take note of where they stood. This does not mean that everyone who visited those monuments or defended them was consciously motivated by racism. Many were not. The mythology had done its work so thoroughly that millions of people genuinely believed they were honoring history, honoring valor, honoring heritage. That is precisely what mythology is supposed to do. It disguises its political purpose as innocent sentiment. And what was the federal government doing while all of this was happening? Largely enabling it. Veterans' reunions, in which Confederate and Union soldiers met and shook hands and called each other brothers, were celebrated as symbols of national healing. Union veterans often participated in the legitimization of Confederate memory, not because they had forgotten what they fought for, but because reconciliation was politically valuable and because racism was widespread in the North as well as the South. The national narrative of Civil War memory shifted from "the Union fought to end slavery and preserve democracy" to "brave men on both sides fought for what they believed in." The second framing was more comfortable. It was also fundamentally dishonest. While all of this mythology was being constructed around his name, Robert E. Lee was doing something considerably more complicated in Lexington, Virginia. He was running a small college. He arrived at Washington College in the fall of 1865 and immediately set about transforming it. He raised funds, modernized the curriculum, introduced practical programs in journalism, commerce, and engineering, at a time when most American colleges were still focused entirely on classical education. He was, by most accounts, an excellent administrator and an inspiring leader of the institution. The college thrived under his presidency in ways it had not before, and arguably has not quite replicated since. But his behavior in these post-war years also revealed things about the man that the mythology carefully omitted. He was opposed to the political rights of African Americans. He testified against Reconstruction policies. He supported the idea that Black Americans should not have the vote, at least not yet, because he believed, in his paternalistic and profoundly limited way, that they were not ready for it. He opposed integrated education. He never publicly expressed regret for joining the Confederacy. He never publicly acknowledged that the war had been about slavery. He applied for restoration of his citizenship rights in 1865, but the paperwork was lost, and he never followed up. His citizenship was not actually restored until 1975 by an act of Congress, more than a century after his death. He also said, repeatedly and publicly, that he was opposed to Confederate monuments. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who became the symbol of Confederate memorialization did not want Confederate monuments built. In 1866, when a proposal was made to erect a monument at Gettysburg, Lee wrote to a former Confederate officer that he did not think it advisable to keep open the sores of war. He thought monuments would interfere with the process of national reconciliation. He thought they would keep resentment alive. He wanted former Confederate soldiers to move on, to become Americans again, to put the war behind them. The people who built statues of him and named streets after him were doing the opposite of what he asked. Lee died on October 12, 1870, of complications from a stroke, 5 years after the war ended. He was 63 years old. He died in his home, with his family around him, surrounded by the quiet of Lexington. The last words attributed to him are, "Strike the tent," a soldier's command to pack up camp and move on. Whether he actually said those words, or whether they were embellished after the fact, they fit the image so perfectly that they were too good not to repeat. Lee died as he had lived, with a sense of ceremony and dignity, or at least with a legend that assigned him those qualities at every available moment. The process of myth-making that had already begun during his lifetime went into overdrive after his death. Jubal Early and his allies now had no living Lee to complicate the narrative. They could build the statue they wanted without the actual man getting in the way. Early wrote a hagiographic biography that became enormously influential. Other former Confederate officers contributed their memories, and in those memories, Lee was always wise, always calm, always right. The defeats were always someone else's fault. The controversial decisions were always brilliantly justified in retrospect. The man who emerged from this literature was not quite human. He was an icon, a symbol, a piece of propaganda disguised as a biography. What makes this propaganda so effective and so durable is that it had truth at its core. Lee really was an extraordinary human being in many respects. His composure under pressure was genuinely extraordinary. His tactical brilliance was real. His personal courage was unquestionable. His care for his men was authentic. These things were not invented. They were genuine characteristics of a genuinely remarkable person. And that reality gave the mythmakers the material they needed to do their work. You cannot build a durable myth entirely out of lies. You need some truth to serve as the skeleton. The flesh they put on that skeleton, the sainthood, the tragic nobility, the political innocence, that was the fiction. But the skeleton was real. By the early 20th century, the lost cause mythology had accomplished something truly remarkable. It had not just preserved a favorable memory of the Confederacy in southern states. It had inserted that memory into the mainstream of American national culture. Textbooks, used in schools across the country, not just in the South, were presenting the Civil War in terms that would have made Jubal Early proud. The war was about states' rights. The South fought nobly for its principles. Slavery was a background issue, not the central cause. Robert E. Lee was not a traitor, but one of the greatest Americans who ever lived. These ideas were not fringe positions held by bitter, unreconstructed Confederates. They were the official educational curriculum. The United Daughters of the Confederacy had been extraordinarily effective in their textbook campaign. They created a list of approved books and a list of books they wanted removed from schools. They pressured publishers directly, threatening commercial consequences. They worked with state school boards, especially, but not exclusively, in southern states. A major publisher with national distribution had enormous incentive to avoid content that would get it boycotted in the entire southern market. The result was a set of national textbooks that taught a version of the Civil War that was, in its most important aspects, simply false. And generations of American children, black and white, northern and southern, learned that false version as established fact. This matters enormously for understanding Robert E. Lee's place in American culture. His reputation was not built by his Confederate supporters alone. It was built into the educational infrastructure of the entire country. American military schools celebrated him, not just as a Confederate general, but as one of the greatest tactical minds in military history, period. Full stop, without qualifiers. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point named a barracks after him. The Army named a base after him. Fort Lee in Virginia was used as a major training installation for generations of American soldiers. An American military base named after a general who fought against the American military. Read that sentence again. The cultural penetration of the Lee myth went even deeper than schools and military bases. Novels celebrated him. Films romanticized him. Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, published in 1936 and made into a film in 1939, did not focus on Lee, but was soaked in lost cause mythology from beginning to end. The Old South it depicted was a world of gracious beauty destroyed by Northern aggression, with the question of what it meant for the millions of enslaved people who lived and died in that world largely reduced to background scenery. The film won 10 Academy Awards. It was seen by more people than almost any film up to that point in history. The mythology it expressed was now American mass culture. Meanwhile, African American historians and writers had been fighting back against this narrative for decades. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his monumental 1935 work, Black Reconstruction in America, demolished the lost cause mythology with meticulous historical evidence. He showed that Reconstruction had not been a period of corrupt black misrule, as the mythology claimed, but a genuine and largely successful experiment in interracial democracy that had been violently destroyed by white supremacist terror. Du Bois was one of the most brilliant scholars of his generation. His book was largely ignored by mainstream white academic historians for decades. The mythology was simply too convenient, too deeply embedded, and too emotionally satisfying to too many people for inconvenient evidence to dislodge it quickly. The word lost in lost cause is doing a lot of work. It implies that the cause was something beautiful and worth mourning. It implies that what was lost was noble. The lost cause narrative turned defeat into tragedy, and tragedy into something almost sacred. It gave the former Confederate states a collective identity organized around shared loss and shared grievance, which is one of the most powerful organizing forces in human social psychology. It gave white Southerners a story that made them the heroes rather than the villains of their own history. And it made Robert E. Lee the face of that story. The face that was noble enough, dignified enough, and genuinely impressive enough that even people who did not share the cause could admire the man. Here is the part of the story that almost nobody tells. The part that, once you know it, makes everything look completely different. Robert E. Lee, the man whose face appears on thousands of monuments, whose name was given to schools and streets and military bases across America, the man who became the living symbol of Confederate honor and the central icon of the lost cause mythology, did not want any of it. Not the monuments, not the mythology, not the sainthood. He said so in plain language, in letters that survived and can be read today. He wanted to be forgotten. He wanted the war to be over, really over, not preserved in bronze and marble for future generations to argue about. In 1866, he wrote that he did not think it would tend to heal the wounds of the nation by keeping open the sores of war. He thought Confederate monuments would reignite bitterness and interfere with the process of becoming Americans again. He thought the Confederate battle flag should be folded up and put away. He never flew it after the war. He never wore his Confederate uniform again. He never publicly celebrated Confederate military victories. He focused entirely on Washington College, on education, on preparing a new generation to participate in a reunified country. The Lee of the post-war years, the actual historical Lee, was trying to do the opposite of what the lost cause movement wanted him to represent. But there is something even more striking, even more fundamental. The entire premise of the Lee mythology, the idea that he was a man of such profound personal honor that he simply could not fight against his own people, rests on a foundation that Lee himself undermined in his own letters. Because Lee did not just defend Virginia when he made his choice. He had the option to simply resign his commission and sit out the war. He could have gone home to Arlington and declined to fight for either side. Several Virginians of comparable standing did exactly that. Lee did not. He actively sought command of Confederate forces. He went looking for the fight. He wanted to lead an army. This is not the behavior of a man reluctantly dragged into a conflict by loyalty to his home. This is the behavior of a soldier who chose his side deliberately and completely. And here is the deepest irony of all. The mythology required Lee to be a man without political agency, a noble figure, swept along by historical forces too large for any individual to resist, a man whose personal virtue was so great that it transcended the politics of his cause. But the real Lee was a man with strong opinions, real choices, and genuine agency. He chose to fight. He chose to keep fighting long after it was clear the cause was hopeless, costing thousands of additional lives. He chose, after the war, not to speak out against racial violence or in support of black civil rights. He chose to remain silent about the causes of the conflict in ways that allowed the mythology to fill the vacuum. These were choices, every single one of them. The scholars who have spent careers studying Lee are increasingly clear on this point. The revisionist wave in Civil War historiography that began in the 1960s and accelerated through the 90s and 2000s systematically dismantled the lost cause narrative with documented evidence. Elizabeth Brown Pryor's biography, Reading the Man, used Lee's own letters to reveal a far more complex and morally compromised figure than the myth allowed. Thomas Connolly's earlier work, The Marble Man, published in 1977, traced the construction of the Lee mythology with surgical precision. These scholars were not trying to destroy Lee's reputation out of political malice, They were trying to recover the actual human being from underneath the marble. Because here is what is genuinely interesting about the real Robert E. Lee, the man rather than the myth. He was not a saint. He was not a monster either. He was a brilliant, deeply honorable man in certain specific ways, who was also the product of a society built on slavery, who benefited from that slavery, who chose to fight to preserve the social order that slavery underpinned, and who then spent the rest of his life not quite reckoning with that choice. He was a man of extraordinary qualities in a deeply extraordinary situation, and the choices he made were both understandable and indefensible, depending on which lens you apply. That complexity is what makes him genuinely interesting, and it is exactly what the mythology had to destroy in order to make him useful as a symbol. In 2017, the city of New Orleans removed 4 Confederate monuments, including a large equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee that had stood in the center of Lee Circle for 130 years. The mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, gave a speech that day that is worth reading in full if you have not already. He said that a man who fought to keep human beings as slaves did not deserve a place of honor in a city that was majority black. He said that these monuments did not rise simply to honor Confederate soldiers. They were built during times of racial backlash to impose a version of history that celebrated a brutal and unjust institution. He was right about all of it. And the speech became national news because the argument it made, which was straightforward and historically accurate, was still controversial. The debate that erupted after Charlottesville in 2017, when white supremacists marched in defense of a Lee statue carrying torches and chanting racist slogans, forced millions of Americans to confront the question that the mythology had been deflecting for a century and a half. What exactly are these statues? Are they historical memorials or political statements? Are they honoring military valor or celebrating the cause those soldiers fought for? Can you separate the man from the cause? Should you? These are genuine questions, and reasonable people can work through them from different directions, but they cannot be worked through honestly without first confronting the actual history, without asking what Robert E. Lee actually stood for, rather than what the mythology decided he stood for. The United States Army renamed all of its installations that have been named after Confederate officers. Fort Lee in Virginia became Fort Gregg Adams in 2023, named after 2 African-American officers who broke racial barriers in the Army. The military academy at West Point removed the portrait of Lee. Statues came down in Richmond, in New Orleans, in Baltimore, in cities and towns across the country. A generation of Americans who had grown up with those statues as part of the landscape discovered that removing them did not erase history. It changed the argument about what history meant. The statues went up to make an argument. Taking them down made a different one. None of this means Robert E. Lee should simply be erased from American memory, or that his story is not worth telling. Quite the opposite. His story is one of the most important in American history, precisely because of what it reveals about how nations construct their own self-image. The story of how a defeated rebel general became a marble saint is a story about the power of narrative, about who gets to write history and who gets silenced. About how lies can be made to look like truth if they are dressed elegantly enough and repeated persistently enough. About how a nation can spend 150 years avoiding a reckoning with its own most foundational sin. Robert E. Lee was a real man. He deserves to be remembered as a real man, not as a saint and not as a monster, but as someone whose life illustrated the terrible human capacity to be both exceptional and deeply wrong at the same time. He was a great soldier who fought for an unjust cause. He was a man of personal dignity who chose to use that dignity in the service of a system built on the degradation of other human beings. He was someone who, by his own stated preferences, would have been horrified by the monument industry that grew up in his name. And he was, finally, someone whose story is not really about him at all. It is about the people who needed him to be something he was not. That is what this story is really about. Not just Robert E. Lee, but what we do with difficult history, what we do when the truth is uncomfortable, what happens when a nation chooses the comfort of myth over the challenge of honest reckoning. The United States is still working through that question. In some ways, every generation has to work through it fresh, and maybe that is actually the right approach. Maybe history is not something you settle once and then file away. Maybe it is something you have to keep arguing about, keep examining, keep subjecting to new evidence and new perspectives. Because the moment you stop arguing about it is the moment the myth-makers win. So here is the question I want to leave you with. And I genuinely want to know what you think, so please write it in the comments. If you had been Robert E. Lee in April of 1861, what would you have done? Would loyalty to your state have outweighed loyalty to your country? Would the values you grew up with have been strong enough to push you in a different direction than he chose? And does knowing all of this change how you see him? Is he a hero, a traitor, a tragedy, or something more complicated than any single word can hold? Drop your answer below. This is exactly the kind of conversation that makes history worth talking about. And if this video shifted your perspective even slightly, then please subscribe to Cradle of Democracy. We tell the stories that your textbooks skipped. Every week, we dig into the moments and the people that shaped the United States, the real ones, not the mythology. And we have another video waiting for you right now about the men and women who fought to put America back together after the Civil War, the unsung heroes of Reconstruction, whose work was buried for a century. The link is on your screen. Click it. You will not be disappointed.